So today's meeting, let me call it that, is to have some final thoughts, first of all, and talk about the assignment. After today's meeting, I will make available on Canvas a module, as it is called. It is one of those weekly things in which I have all the materials for the assignment. And you can then look at the assignment, and also there are some supporting materials there as well. And then from tomorrow, the assignment also opens up in the assignment section. And in this assignment section, you can then submit anything you want there. Yeah. So let me start with an overview of what we do today then. First of all, talking about one more example in which I bring everything together. One more elaborate example, essentially. I will talk about an interesting economy. I will talk about equilibria there, different types of equilibria. I'll talk about balanced equilibria. I'll talk about exploitation, so equality and inequality. And then I will do a little digression to a topic that we did not talk about at all. And that is, what is then the most equal equilibrium that you can have? And even in the most equal equilibrium, you can still have inequality because it is baked into the structure of the economy, the architecture of the economy. I will then move on to second part of today, and that is to talk a little bit about change. I go back to this entrepreneurship, to link it back to that. I mean, we talked about production networks, we talk about these equilibria and how these equilibria can be computed, but how does that link back then to change? And then I will introduce the Brexit as a case study, and I will talk about essentially about what I expect for the assignment, for the essay assignment. And the essay assignment is essentially that you develop your own example that incorporates one of the aspects of Brexit. And I will do a partial example there to show you what I am thinking of. But you're fully free to design your own example, design your own thoughts there. And then I will conclude with some final thoughts. And I would like to propose that if you have any questions related to anything really, that you just ask that during the presentation. So if you still have issues with equality, inequality, all those kind of things, let me know, and I during the presentation, and I will try to answer as best as I can. Maybe that is the best way to go ahead. So when I talk about the assignment, for example, ask any questions you want about the assignment. Yeah. Also, I will post then this assignment after we are done on Canvas. You can download the PDF file with the assignment. I try to be quite comprehensive in the description of what I want, essentially. It is not a free essay. It has somewhere in between, it hangs between a free essay and a kind of exam, because I want a specific structure to the whole thing. But I will talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. So before starting off, does anybody have a question at this time about any of the elements that I want to talk about today?
Is there a guideline for how long our essays should be?
Yeah, I have a maximum, but there's no minimum of 4,000 words. It should be less than that, but that does not include any mathematical formulas that you might have. It does not include tables, and it does not include figures. It does not include references. And if you want to relegate some elaborations or computations or whatever to an appendix, that doesn't count towards that 4,000 either. So it's the pure text. And 4,000 words should be more than plenty. And I hope that people can do it with less. Less is better. But I want to have an upper limit on how much people are going to write. It would be a bit too much. But I will talk about why I think it can be done with relatively few words when we go over the discussion as I planned here in number 3.
Thanks.
Yeah? All right, let me start off then with the final example. I will bring together in this final example the ideas of equality, inequality, and how this whole theory functions one more time. Yeah. So the theory can really focus very well on this equality issue, in my opinion. So that is the main theme, in my opinion, also of what we have been doing. We have a competitive economy, and even in a competitive economy, you can have inequalities that are resulting from the exercise of power. So it's a much more advanced idea than just talking about monopoly or something like that, right? Power comes from the control of flows in the production network. And these controls translate in the pricing of intermediaries. So consumables are always priced through the market. The market is assumed to be competitive. You can always change that, by the way. You can also say, yeah, it's not competitive. Let's introduce an oligopoly, or let's introduce a monopoly, for example. That can all be done. But I chose in this module very clearly for the competitive model. And despite that being competitive for the consumables, it is nothing of that sort for the intermediaries. There are no markets for intermediaries necessarily, because the production technological design, so to say, determines the conditions for the intermediaries, namely how much is needed of intermediaries for the production of these consumables, and how much is needed in those trade relationships. It is not competitive, and as a consequence, it is subject to bargaining, negotiations, and so on. And there is where the power shows up, right? Walmart or Amazon or Apple or BT, just to name a few enormous corporations. What is their power? It is that they are big and that they can set the conditions on their suppliers, and not necessarily on their outputs, right? So Walmart is very competitive with regard to sale prices of their products. But when it comes down to purchasing, procuring those products as inputs for their business, that's when the power shows up. And that is where they negotiate very, very low prices. So they can very sharply price competitively these consumables. And that is what is denoted as the Walmart effect. And this was taken over by Amazon and Apple and all the other corporations. And Amazon is already yesterday's news in some sense, but they were the first to do this properly. Okay, so that is what I mean with in this model. So consumables have always a definitive price, a definite price that is determined by market conditions, demand and supply. And if they have a shift in supply, a shift in demand, that leads to a different price, as we have from traditional market theory. However, intermediary good prices act as a kind of parameters determining the resulting income distribution. And that is very clearly pursued in this example that I'm going to talk about now. And as a consequence, this issue of equality versus inequality is completely determined by these intermediary good prices. So the intermediary good prices are like a parameters in this theory. And by modifying these parameters, you get a different income distribution and you get a different functioning of the economy, essentially. And that is the main story. Yeah. Now there are two types of this manipulation going on, essentially. That is, first of all, what I call a balanced equilibrium. These are specific equilibria in which certain groups of positions, called reference groups, are in balance. There's an equality between those positions in those reference groups. And then there is another possibility, and that is that you have this exploitation of power of critical positions within those reference groups in some sense. Yeah? So that is how I will talk about it. So you take a balanced equilibrium with a certain reference structure, and then you say, okay, one particular position in this particular reference group has a position of power in the production network at a critical position, and they can exert this power. And so that is what I will do in this final example. So before continuing to the final example, are there any questions about the general ideas? Well, this is summarizing what we talked about already quite elaborately in the module, of course. But let me know if there's any question at this time. Okay, so let's build the example. We always start with the production network, of course. And I start off with two suppliers of a basic input. I will not name the input. They deliver that input to one middleman, and that middleman exerts power, of course, in this production network. And then the middleman delivers whatever is produced by A1 and A2 to an X producer and a Y producer, and X and Y are the final consumption goods. So this production network produces 10 units of X and 10 units of Y of consumables. And in this structure that is produced with an input of 5 basic units of a basic intermediary good that is controlled by a middleman. So this is one of the most simplistic production networks in which we can talk about power exerted, because we only talk about essentially one substance produced by A that is used in the production of X and the production of Y. However, that substance takes the form of 2 intermediary goods. So there, I want to emphasize here in this example also that a substance, right, is representable by multiple goods, intermediary goods in particular. So we have intermediary good number 1, which is the bare good produced by A, and then the output of M is the second intermediary good, which is in essence the same as what A produces. However, this is controlled by M. So the control in the network is translated in an additional commodity in some sense. right? By having a middleman, which can be a logistics firm, by the way, you essentially create another commodity to represent that. Yeah? So I emphasize here that the commodity concept goes hand in hand with the we call it the definition of these the definition of the production network, right? So the same material good can be represented by multiple theoretical intermediary goods, and they can have all their own prices. And of course, that reflects that in different parts of the production network, even though it's the same good, in essence, it is not the same good in economic terms, right? So the good transforms itself in multiple incarnations in the economic sense, but not maybe in the material sense, not in the physical sense. Yeah? I hope that distinction is clear, and that defining a good is an essential part of modeling. Yeah? All right, we introduce some prices. Let's first talk about the prices for the final consumption goods. We always need an intermediary, a numeraire, I'm sorry, a numeraire. And that is a good in which we express these prices, and that is X in this particular case. And numeraire is not money. Money is much more than just a numeraire. A numeraire is just a unit of account, and we always select that. Yeah. So the price of X is 1 by assumption. And then the price of Y is P, which is P units of X per unit of Y. And then we have 2 intermediary goods representing the same physical substance, namely the intermediary good produced by A, and then the intermediary good that is produced by M. And we give them a price Q and a price R respectively. I'm assuming consumptive preferences. And here I introduced that the middleman M has different preferences from the other positions. So the 2 A's, so to say, they have the same preference as the X producer and the Y producer, and that is a simple Cobb-Douglas X times Y, while M prefers X much more than Y, and that is expressed by this X cubed times Y as a preference utility function. You can compute then the resulting demand functions by optimizing the preference under the budget constraint, and we get then that half of the income of A, X, and Y is devoted to X, and half of the income to Y, and that for M, 3/4 of the income is devoted to X, and 1/4 of the income is devoted to Y. Yeah. Any questions about this? Okay. So knowing these demand functions, then we can do our computations in the markets for X and Y. Yeah. Now we transform our production network in a simple linear representation of production plans. And the A positions have a production plan 5000. We have 4 commodities here, namely 2 intermediary commodities and X and Y. And A produces 5 of the first intermediary commodity. M has a production plan -10, 10, 0, 0, producing the second intermediary commodity from the first. And X produces with 5 units of the second intermediary good 10 units of X, and Y produces with 5 units of the second intermediary good 10 units of Y. You can write down then the incomes that are associated with that. 5 times Q is the income for A. It's home production essentially. M is 10 times the markup, as we can call that here, right? So R is the price charged by M. Q is the price paid by M for this physical substance. So R minus Q is the markup. And so 10 times R minus Q is the income of the middleman. The income of X is 10 units of output of X sold at the price of 1, that is 10 revenue, minus 5 times R, the price paid to the middleman. And the income for the Y producer is 10 times P, minus 5 times R. Yeah. Okay, so we can then take this and determine viability. What are the price systems that are viable here? And here are those 4 incomes, and they all have to be non-negative. That's the requirement for viability. And so by manipulation, some calculus, we can then derive that we get the following inequalities. Q is at least 0, R is at least Q, and R is has a maximum that is determined by the minimum of 2 and 2 times P, not knowing what P is essentially. Yeah, there are no restrictions on P, essentially only that 2 times P has to be at least R. Yeah. So under these conditions, we get all non-negative incomes, and this is what we impose then. Yeah. Okay. So let's compute all equilibria then. And what I do then is plug those incomes into those demand functions that we have for X. We have 2 positions A, so 2 times the demand of A for X is the total demand generated by the A producers. And the middleman has a demand for X based on the income that I just computed. And X producer and the Y producer similarly. And if we all throw it together, we get a formula with P, Q, and R. And this is a linear form, as you can see, 5 plus 5 times P minus 2.5 Q plus 2.5 R. Now on the supply side, we have just delivery of 10 units. And so we can equate demand is equal to supply and compute the equilibrium price, and the equilibrium price as a consequence, which is P, we can solve for P, becomes in a formula of Q and R. And that formula is 1 plus half times Q minus half times R. Now, when you plug that back into viability, viability becomes then a condition on Q and R since P goes away essentially. There is this minimum of 2 and 2 times P. Well, that translates to this here, as you can see. So Q is at least 0, R is at least Q, and then 1 plus a half times Q is at least R, and 1 plus half times Q is at most 2. So this defines then, if you then plot that into an area in the QR space, so to say. And that area here is the blue area. I use a very primitive plotting software here. And I use the green area for everything below R is equal to 1 plus a half times Q, which is the first inequality that we have with regard to this viability. And then the second inequality was R is at least Q. So the equality R is equal to Q becomes this other area. And that is black. And so the intersection of the green area with the black area is exactly the blue area. And that is capped by 2, by the way. You see that you have exactly a triangular area here. Yeah. So in this triangle are all possible equilibrium intermediary good prices. Yeah. For any QR combination that is in the triangular blue area, we have an equilibrium essentially, and we can compute the corresponding equilibrium price for X, for Y, I'm sorry. Yeah. Any questions? Okay, so we have a huge number of equilibria because this Q and this R act as parameters in this model. And we can then ask ourselves, well, what about certain Q and R? How will that function? Can we talk about equality, inequality in this example as a consequence? Yeah. Before we do that, let's compute the resulting equilibrium incomes. As you can see, it's all formulas of Q and R. The only income really that changes is that of Y. We plug in that equilibrium price and then we compute that that income becomes 10 plus 5 times Q minus 10 times R. If you all add it up, you get the GDP of this model. That is 20 plus 5 times Q minus 5 times R. And you see that for different Qs and Rs, we get different GDP levels, even though the underlying productive economy remains exactly the same. Yeah. We can also compute the equilibrium consumption, right? I plug in all these equilibrium incomes, and you can, if you want, you can manipulate that further to maybe simplify it a bit. I kept here 2 times P, for example, in this computation, and we have to plug in that P is equal to 1 minus half times the markup that M applies, essentially. Yeah. Any questions with regard to this? Right. There are 2 obvious balanced equilibria that beg to be analyzed. The first one is to say, okay, A and M go together with X, with Y, and the other one is A and M go together with X. So I did first AM together with Y in one reference group, and X in its own reference group, and we can call that the AMY equilibrium. And then by equating those incomes, I get equations, 2 equations with 2 unknowns, essentially. I get 3Q is equal to 2R and Q is equal to 2 minus 2Q. When you plug that back in, and you can solve that then. And what do we get? We get that Q is 2/3, R is 1, and P is 5/6. And you can plug it all back in the system, and you can check whether this is viable or not. And indeed, this is a viable equilibrium as a consequence. So we can go ahead and then compute the resulting incomes. And you see here that A, M, and Y get an income of 3 1/3, and X get an income of 5. And that the GDP that is generated in this case is 18 1/3. And you see then that the equilibrium consumption can also be computed as a consequence. Yeah. Okay. And the other equilibrium, you do exactly the same exercise, but then with A, M, and X, which seems to be the other natural reference group, essentially. Taking into account that M is quite powerful and that A is really, the A positions are in some sense subordinate to this M. So whoever M is collaborating with, X or the Y, that determines the equilibrium in some sense. And you can compute again these equalities. can manipulate them and I get again 3Q is equal to 2R and Q is equal to 2 minus R. And you can compute that then and you get Q is 4/5, R is 1/1/5, and P is 4/5. And see that you have a different equilibrium. And we have to check again viability. And again, it shows it's not a problem. And there we are. We can compute the resulting income distribution, which is for A, M, and X, we get 4 as an income, and for Y, 2. And you see that the GDP that is generated in this case is a little bit lower, that's 18. And the resulting consumption bundles, we can also compute from the demand function. Okay, so this is balanced equilibria. Balanced equilibria, to summarize, are based on reference groups. In these reference groups, we impose equal treatment of the positions that are in that reference group, and we can do the computations by balancing those incomes, and then it leads to a certain outcome for those parameter prices, so to say, the Q and the R, and we get a nice resolution. And in this particular case, it all works. There is no violation of viability, even though in examples I talked about during the module, some of them, some balance equilibria are simply not possible because they violated the viability conditions. Some positions got negative incomes, in other words. In this particular case, it all works out fine. And these are the results. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about exploitation by this middleman. And what I will do is we take as a reference, so to say, the AMX equilibrium. So the AMX structure, reference structure, is the starting point. And we assume that M starts to exploit her position in the context of the AMX reference group. And what does that mean? There remains a balance between the income of A and X. And then you get one equation with two variables, Q and R. And so it leads then to this equality Q is equal to 2 minus R. And then you can plug that back into the price and you get then that the equilibrium price in that particular case is also 1 minus half times R minus Q. And this markup is essentially 2R minus 2 if you plug in that Q is 2 minus R. And so when you explore that, you get then that the price P is equal to 2 minus R as well. So Q and P become equal in this particular case. And this results from the equality of the incomes of A and X. Yeah. So R is the variable that is set by the middleman. That is under the control of the middleman in this particular story. And so we take that into our computations. So we plug in Q is equal to 2 minus R, we plug in P is equal to 2 minus R, and then compute the resulting equilibrium incomes. And so you get 10 minus 5 times R, 20R minus 20 for the income of the middleman, M, and the Y income is 20 minus 15R. Now, if you impose then viability, we see that R has to be somewhere between 1 and 1/1/3, right? So if R is equal to 1, that's the lower bound, then we have the middleman having no income. And when R is 1/1/3, we see that the Y producer has a 0 income. Yeah. Okay, so what did I do? I took the general equilibrium form, including the computed general equilibrium price P as a formula of R and Q, and I plugged in that the income of A has to be equal to the income of X, leading to a certain solution for Q, plugging that solution all back in, and you get that everything is stated now as a formula of R. And R becomes the only variable, and that is under the control of M, and M can manipulate R as a consequence up to a certain degree. As you can see here, it can never exceed 1/3, because then Y would go out of business and the whole economy collapses in some sense. So there are natural bounds on this exploitation as well. You cannot overcharge. It is not that we assume infinite flexibility, like we have with standard monopoly theory, for example. There's always a demand, regardless of what the price is for that good. We always assume there is a demand because we assume a complete, nice demand function. In this case, that is not the case. There is no demand function here. There's only the production network, and that is fixed, and that is inflexible. And as a consequence, R cannot exceed a certain threshold unless it bankrupts some positions in the production network. In this particular case, Y. So M will set, of course, the maximum value, the maximum variable value, and that means 1/3. And we can compute the corresponding Q and P, that is 2/3 then, and we get an income distribution with A and X having an income of 3 1/3. M has an income of 6 2/3, and Y has an income of 0. And the GDP that is generated is then 16 2/3, which is lower than what we had before. Yeah. So what are the consequences of the exploitation of the power by M? We get a reduction of GDP, and we get the complete depletion of Y's position translated in income. I want to emphasize here also that a zero income, right? It is based on this idea of opportunity cost. A zero income doesn't mean there is actually nothing to eat. It is in some sense an excess income that we are considering here. If you want to be completely precise, you should introduce in the production network these sustenance relationships that in order for a position to be reproduced, so to say, it needs certain inputs, and you can then plot that with arrows going into all positions from the X producer and the Y producer to for the reproduction consumption, so to say. And then the consumption becomes an excess consumption and a luxury consumption, so to say, yeah, beyond the reproduction. Okay. So this is what I discussed here. Yeah. Okay. What I would like to suggest is that we take a short break here for a few minutes, take a breath, and then I will continue with talking about some more about equality from a different perspective, using this whole setup slightly differently to talk about a kind of excursion into a different area that we did not talk about so far. All right, let's take a 2-minute break, 2:45, we resume. All right, let's continue. I want to conclude the example by talking about the question, what is now the most equal situation that you can have in this economy? And of course, situation refers to equilibrium, right? So taking this big set of general equilibria, this triangular area in the QR space that correspond to viable general equilibria, which of those is now the most equal? And of course, you can answer this in different ways, because how do you measure equality? You need to agree on something, how to measure that. You can use, for example, standard deviation. You can use maybe some other tool. You don't have to use standard deviation, which is based on the squares of the differences. You can take another measure, maybe a higher power or a completely different logic, like the Gini coefficient, where you plot essentially the income distribution and then you measure how far it is away from the purely theoretical completely equal income distribution. And that area, the size of that area, is then the Gini coefficient. But I want to talk about one of the easiest ideas to measure inequality, and that is the idea introduced by Rawls. Rawls is essentially a philosopher from the 60s who wrote a book in 1971 called The Theory of Justice, which was a fundamental text in formulating ideas about equality and inequality and relating it also to justice. It's philosophy, of course, but it is a very economic kind of philosophy, and a lot of economists have picked up those ideas, and these ideas can be translated very easily in mathematics. And that is what I will do here, right? So he introduced essentially a tool for thinking about equality in an economy. And he called that the veil of ignorance. And the veil of ignorance refers to the fact that in this particular story of ours, you do not know a priori what position you will occupy in the production network. You will not know where you end up. Do you end up in A? Do you end up in M? Do you end up in X or Y? You do not know. Therefore, you want to have a situation that makes it as fair as possible in this production network, right? And that means that you take the worst case into account, and that is the position with the lowest income, and you should then say, well, the position with the lowest income, well, that income should be maximal. So it becomes a maxi-min equilibrium. So that is the mathematical formula that we get from this reasoning, right? If you do not know which position you will occupy in the production network, what you want to do is that you want the worst possible case to be as good as possible. And that is exactly what we can do in our theory, and that we can call the maxi-min equilibrium or the Walsian equilibrium. Yeah. So what we can do is compute over all possible positions for arbitrary Q and R, the minimum. And then we want to maximize that. I want to choose that Q and that R that maximizes that minimum. That's what we really will do, right? So what is a Walsian equilibrium then in mathematical terms? Here it is stated as one small formula. I don't know whether you're familiar with all the symbolism here, but what we will do is you read it from the back essentially. You have this income for every position as a function of this P and this R. This is the equilibrium. Sorry, it's a typo there. It should be a Q and an R, and it should be a Q cross and an R cross. I'm sorry, there's a typo here. So the income of position A is a function of the Q and the R. We know that the Q and the R is in this area, in this triangular area. It's an equilibrium, right? So the viability conditions hold. Now we take all these incomes for all positions and we determine the minimum for that. So for a given Q and an R, I have now computed the minimum income in the production network. And then I will choose the Q and the R, not the P and the R, the Q and the R in the set of viable price systems that maximizes that minimum. Yeah. So it's a maxi-min. And this ARG in front of that is abbreviation for argument, and that is the solutions. So the Wilson equilibrium is really a set of intermediary good prices such that it solves the maxi-min problem over the income of all positions. Are there any questions about this? Okay, so mathematics is a very powerful tool. It summarizes in just a few phrases a whole set of ideas in some sense. Yeah. The main thing is we can compute this thing, and it is not that hard. We have to do a little bit of manipulation, but we can do it. We go back to the picture that we had. Remember, we had this triangular area in the QR space. And this triangular area, we are going to now in that area determine what is now the minimum income. What is the minimum income in this triangular area? And we will see that this is determined by income inequalities in some sense. And the borderlines of these income inequalities are determined by income equalities. So we have as a first income equality that is essential in the description of the minimum income, that the income of A is equal to the income of M. And what is that? That is a certain line given by R is equal to 1.5 times Q. I take the equilibrium incomes that we formulated earlier on and equate the income of A with income of M and solve it. And I get then the formula R is equal to 1.5 times Q. And you see that is that line that I've drawn here in this space, and it cuts right through that triangle. Yeah. The second is income of A is equal to the income of Y. And that happens at R is equal to 1. And as you can see, that is the second red line that I've drawn there. And that cuts right through that triangular area as well. And finally, the only other income equality condition is that income of M is equal to the income of Y. That income equality is the third line, the third red line, and that is given by R is equal to 1/2 plus 3/4 times Q. And as you can see, these lines very nicely cut up this triangle into pieces. They all intersect at the same point as well, which is remarkable when you think of it, because that means there is a point where A and M and Y all have the same income level. Yeah, and that is given by that intersection of those three lines. What we also what we don't see is the other income equations. I deleted those because those are not relevant, because those are not concerning the minimum income. I manipulate the presentation a little bit. There's some computations in the background and that you have to take into account, that the other income equalities do not matter. They lead to things in particular related to the income of X. The income of X is never the minimum, for example, right? So that is something you find out by manipulating the example a little bit further and doing some calculus in the background. And I have chosen not to present that. So all these things are not that easy. All right, but anyway, when we then inspect what the minimum is in the various areas in the cut up blue area, we see that in 2 areas between equation 1 and equation 2, that area there we have that the minimum income is the income of A. And then there is another area consisting of 2 pieces of this puzzle, where the minimum income is that income of Y. And then in the final area, we have that the minimum income is the income of M. So now we get 3 areas in this triangular space where we have identified now the minimum income. So what I've done is I have determined for any arbitrary Q and R combination the minimum income, and we get this picture as the answer to that. So this picture says that in this green area the minimum income is the income of A. In the bluish area the minimum income is the income of Y, and in the yellow area it is the minimum income is that of M. And this cuts up therefore this triangle into 3 smaller triangular areas. And now the question then is, where is the maximum? But we can then look at that. So where is the maximum of these minima, so to say? And we can do that by looking at these minimum incomes and compare them. And then we see, after some manipulation, that the maximal incomes actually occur exactly at the intersection point of these 3 lines that we determined. And what is that intersection point? That happens exactly at Q is 2/3 and R is 1. And we see then that this is exactly the AMY equilibrium, the AMY balanced equilibrium that we investigated before. And you can indeed go back to that, and you can see that indeed the income distribution is pretty equal there. It is indeed the least, the minimum income in that income distribution is indeed maximal. And it's interesting to see that it corresponds exactly to a balanced equilibrium. In this particular case, this AMY equilibrium, as you can see here. Okay, so this is a little excursion going beyond what we talked about, using the possibilities of the theory to compare equilibria. That's essentially what we do. We compute for every Q and R that is viable, the equilibrium, and then we compare the conditions that this equilibria generate in the economy. And then we can determine, with regard to a certain criterion, the optimal equilibrium, so to say. And in this particular case, that criterion is this maximin, the Rawlsian criterion, so to say. Are there any questions? Okay, so our theory suits very well the comparison of equilibria in essentially a static economy. The economy remains exactly the same, but these intermediary good prices act as parameters to be able to study essentially all kinds of things that might happen even in the static economy. Who has the power and who has not. And so those elements can be translated in certain considerations with regard to those parameters and the income distributions that are generated. And that is what makes this theory essentially so useful, in my opinion. Right? So an equilibrium is not just an equilibrium, it is tied in with a whole set of viable equilibria, and we can study therefore what if questions. This brings me then to some further thoughts, and that brings it back to development of the economy and entrepreneurship that we talked about. And that is that these production networks are evolving all the time, and they might be deepening, they might be imploding, they might be modified in a substantial way. And this is part of this institutional economic development. And I called that the architecture, if you might remember. So this architecture is ever evolving. It is in movement, so to say. Yeah. And this movement sometimes translates in this deepening. So one of these evolving forces is the deepening that we talked about. We talked about that from the very first beginning. And what does this translate to? Well, this translates to introducing new goods, in particular new intermediary goods, new professions, new positions, and extending these production networks, those supply chains. They become longer and longer and longer. And this has consequences, of course, right? So the modifications of these production networks lead to all kinds of consequences. This ties in with these three different types of entrepreneurs that we talked about, and this idea of the weak entrepreneurial force. So weak, I refer here to very modest changes that when you do many, many, many changes, it adds up to really something substantial. And over time, we can really get substantial modifications in the economy. But you can also have these entrepreneurial types that with one big blow, they make tremendous changes to the economy. So those are Schumpeterian entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs that modify commodities essentially and production technologies. Burtian entrepreneurs that modify trade relationships in the production network, who's trading with whom, who has a position of power and who has not. And then Baumollian entrepreneurs, those affect the institutions, the underlying institutional structure on which this production network is functioning. And Baumollian entrepreneurs, in many, many cases, are politicians who want to put a stamp on society, thereby modifying the economy in a substantial way. Yeah, and all of them can be positive forces, or they can be detrimental forces, right? Some Schumpeterian entrepreneurs can introduce more new commodities, thereby weakening the architecture of the production networks, making the economy more susceptible to crises and collapse, introducing more weak points in the economy. Burtian entrepreneurs can do exactly the same, and Baumollian entrepreneurs similarly. So all of these can be very positive things, and you can generate much more wealth, but it can also be detrimental, leading to undermining of the functioning of the economy, undermining of the functioning of the production network, leading ultimately to larger inequalities in the economy, for example. Yeah. So I just want to illustrate that with a little picture, right? Here I just have super simplistic production network. You have a producer of X and a producer of Y, and they home produce, and that's it. This is the most primitive state the economy can be in. Notice that most textbooks in economics are actually talking about this kind of production because that is what is usually assumed. But then we get that the economy evolves, more Schumpeterian entrepreneurs show up and they introduce intermediary goods. You get much more advanced production technologies and you get a deeper division of labor, and this leads to much higher outputs, but it also involves more people. And you can do that multiple times and you get a deepening and a deepening and a deepening of these chains. The chains become longer and their weaknesses emerge, right? And centers of power, for example, emerge. Yeah. So, for example, we see here a middleman popping up. If suddenly two middlemen in these networks introducing power essentially, and that can be exploited and can be quite detrimental to the economy, the functioning of the economy. So the architecture of the economy completely changes from one to the next development, and that can lead to tremendous crisis, and but it can also be highly productive. So it's a scale. It is on the one hand, and on the other hand, on the one hand, higher productivity, but on the other hand, maybe larger inequality because you get these positions of power. And that is something that is very much at play at the moment in our global economy. We know the players that have all this power, and those are the big corporations, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, but also maybe older corporations that are in positions of tremendous power, the oil companies, for example. Yeah. So what we see then that the architecture changes, but it can lead to more vulnerabilities. It can affect resilience of the supply chains. Resilience is a term from supply chain management, but it is important that we start to think in economics about that as well, because it is so important. And it also affects the performance of these economies in all regards. And that then refers to these historical economic disasters that we have seen. 1873 and 2008 stand out as crises that were caused essentially by the same thing, namely a financial sector that was deepening, developing, and it was leading to all kinds of structural vulnerabilities in the production networks in the financial sector that collapsed. And crisis of 1873 and 2008 look very, very similar in that regard. Yeah. 1929 is slightly different, but also there, it is the vulnerabilities in the production network that led to that. Yeah. And these developments lead also to opportunities for exploitation and increased inequality in the economy. And that is what we see today. Today, this inequality is extreme, and it has resulted into a very unbalanced global economy, in which in particular some nation states are suffering quite badly from this exploitation. And that there are some really detrimental issues now emerging, quite seriously affecting how we live and how we function. I just want to mention the housing market, right? Deliberate policies by successive governments in the West, in particular. I'm not only talking about the UK here, I'm talking about also about all the other countries. In particular, policies with regard to quantitative easing in response to this crisis, in particular 2008, but then also the follow-up crisis, the euro crisis, for example, and the issues now, right, with regard to COVID. The response has been to pump money into the economy, but they did that in a very unequal way because all the money ended up in the bank accounts of large financial institutions. And these large financial institutions will not willy-nilly hand that out to everybody. They will steer those funds to particular clients that they have. And those are large investors, other financial institutions, and people that are already wealthy and invest, for example, in housing. So a lot of this money ended up in the capital markets. That's why we have this enormous boom in the stock market, and it ended up in the housing market. And so we see an enormous boom in the housing market. And this is only strengthened by things like the reduction of stamp duty and those kind of things that are also enacted by these governments under the guise of making it easier and better for normal people to buy houses. But in fact, it leads to further making problems because it becomes less and less affordable. So this is not only in the UK, it is also elsewhere in Europe, in the United States. All housing is at the moment exploding during this COVID crisis, which is a remarkable thing because when you do a classical economic reasoning, COVID introduced tremendous uncertainties in the economy. Why would people buy houses now, right? If you are having a property, why would you move now, today, given that you have this uncertain income stream with regard to what is going on? So that is not happening somehow, and that is not happening because of all these support measures that were introduced, and in particular this quantitative easing in some sense. Anyway, this leads me then to the question, can we properly evaluate and assess these changes in the architecture of the economy in our global economy? Yeah? And that is that we need to be able to measure things properly, right? And this module is partially trying to do that. How do you measure these things? And you measure that by going to the most primitive elements, and those are commodities, and to have a commodity model of production, right? And not a monetary model, not a financial model, but real input quantities that you that you measure and then can do computations with. Yeah. Okay. This can then lead to comparing those equilibria, for example. You can do a sensitivity analysis. And of course, there are all these elements that we did not really address, except in the last lecture I talked about collective goods, but that was just a small excursion. That was not the essence of this module. And it was just to show how you can treat collective goods in this setting. And you see the complications of these issues that leads to a much more complex analysis. It is very hard to assess certain changes in the economy, in particular when it comes to collective goods and collective good structures. Yeah, and this also refers then to the architecture of the economy itself in some sense. So I think what economics needs, in particular in the future, is that we really need to link much more with this network perspective of the economy, right? The economy is not a market economy. We are living in a network economy. And this network perspective leads naturally to something that is close to supply chain analysis, but also to old ideas in economics, old ideas that have been neglected and forgotten. And I refer here to Schrafa in particular, a completely neglected theory of how the world can be considered to function, so to say, a certain perspective on the functioning of the economy, which was never properly developed. And the Schrafa theory, the Schrafian theory, also opens the door to include very substantial analysis of the environment, for example, a much more comprehensive understanding of the environment. Circular economies, for example, circular economies refer to recycling, for example. If you have this commodity perspective in combination with the network perspective that we developed, namely the production network theory, so to say, you can talk about how products are recycled, and you get these circular flows in these production networks, and you can price them, and you can see what is viable and what is not, and you can see how you can make it viable, and how therefore you can see whether you can protect the environment better by recycling more products in that way, and to make it profitable for to have a recycling of products. So these perspectives, they lead to new ideas that can be incorporated. Also note that markets never went away in this theory that I presented. Markets were always there, and this is called Walrasian economics. This is the mainstream economics. Walrasian economics became neoclassical economics in some sense. These ideas are still fundamentally in this idea that we developed in this module as well. So there is a way to expand all of this to capture a lot of very important issues in our contemporary global economy. So I want to emphasize that I believe very much that theory remains very important today, even though it has been neglected in economics quite a bit, and there has been a movement to much more empirical work. We need thought experiments. We need thought experiments to think about things, to develop new ideas, to see what we can do. That is how a lot of science works. I mean, when you look at the history of physics, for example, all of physics is based on thought experiments, right? All of these big ideas that they confirmed later on in experiments, the Higgs boson and these particles, all of them were first thought up in purely theoretical exercises. In the brain of Einstein, in the brain of Niels Bohr, they came up with these ideas and they presented that, and they were confirmed in practice by experimentation in the form of practical experiments, of course, not thought experiments. Anyway, thought experiments clarifies the mind, clarifies the ideas, and this is how we should see theory. Theory is telling stories to each other. What if? Can we work it out? And mathematics is just a language in that regard. It expresses these ideas. Yeah? Very, very little of that is done at the moment in economics. There's a lot of empirical work done, and the theory that is done is no longer really engaging with these big issues. It's very mundane, very small thought, so to say. It is game theory, do a little game this, a little game that, and compute and all that. Many of those have very little to do with thinking about the issues that are related to the global economy at this time. At least that is how I feel. Yeah. And that makes me kind of sad, because I think we could do much better. Okay, any questions? So these was, yeah.
So going back to the fact that entrepreneurship can be productive or destructive, has there been any development regarding what determines whether it would be productive or destructive?
That is one of the big issues that is completely undeveloped at this time. There's very little going on in the area of entrepreneurship at the moment from a kind of economic perspective, sadly enough. So what is good entrepreneurship? What is bad entrepreneurship? In theory, of course, we can do it. You can take a production network model, and then you can ask, well, by changing the production network, can we get a higher productivity or not? But one of the things that we know from historical cases in particular is that everything has two sides. There are good results from certain activities, and there always is something bad as well, right? So when you go to a historical entrepreneurial event, you know, like Henry Ford introducing automated production lines in his factory, well, this increased productivity tremendously, but it also dumbed down work, and it undermined job satisfaction, and it made people less happy as a consequence that were working in those factories, right? So there's a good side and a bad side, and these are the direct effects in some sense. We're not even talking about the further down the downstream effect, so to say, for the global economy of this modification. So what we see is that nearly all entrepreneurial activity is having good effects and bad effects, and it's not so obvious. When Ford introduced this automation, it was not obvious that you got this unsatisfactory job culture, so to say, and that people got depressed. And we are looking now at a world where people are relatively unhappy in work, right? It is, people are not they're not very happy at the moment at all in how the economy is functioning. And this is an important thing, because the economy is not about goods necessarily only. It is also about well-being. And this is a completely unexplored area as well. Well-being is extremely hard to theorize about, to measure. And we need to do a lot of work to really understand that better. Yeah. All right. Okay, so I've been talking about the theory, what we can do with it. And this brings me then to the essay assignment, because that is essentially an assignment that you do something with the theory to talk about Brexit. That's how I would like to formulate it. Brexit is, of course, a big entrepreneurial event. And it changes tremendously the architecture of our economy in particular, the UK economy and the Northern Irish economy in particular within that UK economy, but also within the European economy. Right? To a second degree, it impacts, of course, European economies quite much as well, and even the global economy. And as usual, there are good things and bad things, right? Although in the debate, the good things have been very much emphasized by Johnson, completely neglecting, of course, all the bad things that have been going on. And the bad things might here outweigh the good things. Namely, what is the big problem? The big problem is bureaucracy, right? The EU is a big vacuum cleaner that sucked up tremendous amounts of bureaucracy that were hampering the functioning of the European economy. That's how we can interpret the EU from this perspective, right? All these regulations and all these rules related to trade across borders were essentially reduced or completely taken away, right? First they were reduced and then they were completely taken away. Trade deals are not only about tariffs. And that is the fallacy that we saw in the debate about Brexit. Everybody was only talking about these tariffs. Oh, there would be tariffs and it would be so detrimental for business, all these tariffs. What is maybe even more detrimental is the huge cost related to bureaucracy and regulations and rules and all kinds of really silly things. So suddenly, even though we, for years and years, did not play any role whatsoever, suddenly the regulation about soil is affecting the transportation of plants from UK to Northern Ireland, right? Because soil is not allowed to be transported into the European Union socioeconomic space. That's really the rule. And that is with regard to disease and all that stuff. So you need a special accommodation for that. And that is out of reach for many, many companies. So in short, transaction costs have exploded in the past months, essentially. The past couple of months have seen this enormous explosion of transaction costs. And it has become so expensive to trade now that a lot of small and medium businesses can no longer afford that. So the only ones that really can navigate this enormous cost increase are global corporations. The car industry is continuing, even though for a while it was thought that the car industry would have a tremendous blow and that British car making would be become prohibitively expensive as a consequence. That did not happen because they are able to deal with it. The same holds for very large financial corporations. They are dealing with it as well, but they're also dealing with it by moving operations, of course, to completely new locations. So we get a real modification of the architecture of the production networks in the economy. Yeah. So the EU GB trade has diminished significantly. That has been reported already for the months after the Brexit deal was done. And with regard to the Northern Irish economy in particular, and the Irish economy as well, the supply chains are now no longer involving GB, Great Britain, but they go directly from the European Union to Ireland instead of using GB. So a lot of trade traveled physically through Great Britain by truck, by train, whatever it was. That is now avoided, and you have much larger operations that move trade directly from France to Ireland. So the model was for the Northern Irish economy that a lot of trade was EU to GB to NI with 2 short ferry hops, essentially, for a truck, namely from across the channel and then across the Irish Sea. This has now been modified by EU to France, and then from France to an Irish port directly, much longer ferry trip, so to say, and then to Northern Ireland by truck. And that model is, of course, much more expensive. So regardless, costs have increased tremendously, and profitability suffers as a consequence. It should be clear. And this is one of the main themes for this assignment in some sense. Yeah. So what I want for the assignment is essentially that you model the change in the architecture of the production network that reflects this, and that you debate before Brexit the performance of that economy by looking at certain equilibria, and then post-Brexit in a modified economy, the modified production network, you compute similar equilibria and you compare them to see how this affects business and what you can learn from it in some sense. It's a theoretical exercise. It's a computational exercise. You can give it any form you want to give it. You can plug in your own numbers, your utility functions, production plans, whatever you want. You can make that fully specific. The architecture of the production network also make it fully specific, and do your computations with it. And I showed you in this elaborate example how this can be done. You can compare different equilibria that emerge within the 2 architectures, so to say, the pre-Brexit and the post-Brexit architecture. And then you can compare across, and you can measure the performance directly, and you can see what happens. Let me do an example. So looks pretty much like the example I had before with this middleman. So you have 2 producers of a certain intermediary good. A logistics firm takes this on and transports it to producers in the EU. So Northern Irish producers produce an intermediary good. Logistics firm takes that on and transports it to the Netherlands, let's say. I took the Netherlands as an example. And there it is used as an intermediary input for the production of a certain good. Here I only have 1 output X, but you could do it with multiple outputs as well. I want to emphasize what happens with Brexit. So let me modify this now to reflect what happens with Brexit. So the first step is that I want to introduce a comparison between the traditional supply chain which works through Great Britain, and then a modified supply chain that goes directly from an Irish port to the Netherlands. So it no longer uses Great Britain as a hub, so to say, a transportation hub. So in order to do that, I will distinguish then that we have 1 producer who uses this transportation network through GB to the Netherlands, and one producer that uses the Irish transportation network, so to say, the trade route. In order to do that, we need to split them up. We need to go to a model of 2 supply chains, essentially. We can no longer have it as one. We need to distinguish those 2. And we need to do that by introducing multiple new commodities to describe this properly. So what I do is I will split up those 2. And that's exactly what I do here. I split one A from the other A, so to say. And I split up the logistics firm into 2 pieces. One that uses the GB route and the other that uses the direct route, so to say. And this introduces multiple commodities because the intermediary commodity that goes through the GB route should be labeled differently. It's a different economic commodity from the commodity that goes through the direct route from Ireland to the Netherlands, not using GB. Okay, now the second element that needs to be done is introduce this higher transaction costs. So what we will do is I'm going to modify further this production network by introducing costs. And what are those costs? Those are essentially commodity inputs that are now required by regulation for the logistics element. So work has to be done, and I introduce here the symbol W for that. We introduce workers that do this bureaucratic stuff. And there's a certain quantity of bureaucratic stuff to be done if you trade through GB, and there's a certain quantity of bureaucratic stuff to be done when you do the direct route. Those could be different. So you could introduce a delta and a gamma, a capital delta and a capital gamma as quantities of these bureaucratic inputs, and those have to be paid for. Those are the increased costs of the bureaucracy. And then the productivity might be affected. This small delta and the small gamma that I put in front of that output level X, that reflects that because it is much more difficult, there is simply less trade possible because you get capacity constraints that were not there before. And so this is a very simplistic expression of this idea that there's a second effect to this Brexit, namely the productivity directly. You can also just assume that away and say, oh, this delta is 1 and this gamma is 1. And then you have your old output levels back again. Yeah. Anyway, this is just an example. Okay, this is not what I ask you to do. You have to come up with your own network. You want to debate a certain issue maybe with regard to Brexit, not the general thing. And you want maybe to do a little bit more integrated production network, for example. And you can talk about different scenarios with regard to that integrated production network, rather than splitting it up into different supply chains, like I did here. Yeah. So now you can analyze the effects of Brexit by using these modifications. And so you can compute all the equilibria before Brexit with the old production network. You can look at the income distribution. You can look at the resulting GDP. You can look at the resulting equilibrium prices. And then you can compute everything that happens after Brexit. And you can then do a sensitivity analysis with regard to certain parameter values. In this particular case, these gammas and these deltas. Yeah. So for different gammas, the capital gamma and small gamma, you can make changes. And for different deltas, you can do these analysis and compute the various outcomes. Yeah. So what would be the impact of Brexit? What reasonable values of these parameters do you think apply? And what would be then the result? Yeah. Okay, so that's essentially what I want to ask you to do in the assignment. You develop an economy, a model, a complete model, including production network, including the goods, what is traded exactly, what is not, the exact trade relationships, and then utility functions as well, because you have this demand side in the economy as well, because without that, it does not really make a lot of sense. And then you modify that to go to a post-Brexit model. And then you do a recomputation of the equilibria that you looked at pre-Brexit. You look at this equilibria post-Brexit, and then you make a comparison. And you can also do, using these variable parameters, these cost parameters, so to say, you can do a sensitivity analysis. Yeah. So the main effects is really related to transaction costs, direct transaction costs. And in the theory that we use here, that needs to be translated to the usage of intermediary goods, new services in particular, services that, that need to be performed. Filling out forms, for example, at the least, so to say. And maybe having increased logistics costs. And all of this should be translated in work that has to be done and new agents that need to be hired to perform additional work. And that is how it should be translated into the production network. And that is what I'm looking for in the assignment. Yeah. Are there any questions? Did I make it clear, or does it need more clarification? So I described this as well in the assignment itself. I will post that after we're done today on Canvas, and you can read there. And if you have any questions, let me know. So this assignment is not really that you can write an arbitrary essay. It is a very structured assignment in that regard, because you need to develop a model, and then you explore certain issues that you want to explore, and you play around with the production network, and you change the architecture of the production network to reflect these changes of this of Brexit, so to say, as a consequence of Brexit. All right, if there are no more questions. All right, then what I will do is have some concluding thoughts. Yeah. So what I did in this final review is use the theory in a certain way. And what I want to emphasize here is that the theory provides a way of thinking about the world, and to think about events and policies, how they affect the functioning of the economy from a certain particular perspective. And that is very much the perspective of commodities and trade relationships, right? So it is a commodity-based perspective. It is not a market-based perspective as a consequence. It is a network-based perspective, but the commodities are the constituting elements of that network. And in particular, the intermediary commodities play a very, very important role, and they can be used to explain the equality, the inequality that we see, and also the productivity that we can measure. And you can apply, therefore, sensitivity analysis across the different equilibria that might emerge. We get a very large set of possible equilibria because of the variability of the intermediary good prices. And you can therefore do very easily a sensitivity analysis. And that is what I aim for with regard to this assignment, with regard to Brexit. So it is a thought framework. Yeah. And in that thought framework, we talked about Adam Smith versus Ricardo, the Smithian logic versus the Ricardian logic of the social division of labor. We talked about Marx versus the neoclassical perspective, the Marx about exploitation. This can be very easily expressed in these networks, but also the neoclassical framework can be expressed in these networks. Although it becomes a very simplistic kind of world where everything is home produced in some sense. And then there are these very strong links to this, through this linear representation, to Leontief, the input-output analysis of the economy, and Schraffa, which is a more is a more advanced departure from Leontief in some sense. All right, and that is what I wanted to talk about today, and I hope I did a reasonable job to formulate some final thoughts and to go one more time over the theory using this example, this very elaborate example. Are there any questions? All right, if there are no questions, then I will conclude, and then what I will do next is post the assignment, the official, Ryan?
Hi, Rob. Could I just ask a question about platforms and competence that you were talking about a few weeks ago, or maybe more than a few weeks ago? How can you kind of battle against that incompetence that's arising? How do you fix that problem with platforms? You know, how can you address that problem?
Well, it is baked into the platform in some sense. So the platform, because of its nature, leads to incompetence because everything is outsourced, and you get this philosophy of outsourcing, and that makes you incompetent. So the only way to modify that, to remedy that, is a distributed economy. And a distributed economy is much more equal also, because the platform leads to all this inequality as well. So everything is tied in with that platform and all the issues that play a role in our global economy at the moment. But this is not straightforward, of course. This is really an extremely difficult thing. This simple phrase, make it more distributed, might be nearly impossible to really implement, because what you need is political power. Politicians have to be on board, and we live in systems where politicians are so much affected by large corporations that they're not willing to enact policies against these large corporations, and this leads then to the fact that we don't do anything about it at the moment, right? So the latest, just today in the news, was how little Amazon is paying in tax, and that they pay some tax in all these countries, but it is very little, and they make special deals. And the amount of money paid by the headquarters, which is in Luxembourg, is zero. because they managed to create an artificial loss at the headquarters. And most of the operations are actually from the headquarters. So if you do an order from Amazon, it comes from officially from Luxembourg, and everything is billed to the Luxembourg headquarters. And so whatever is paid in these other countries is minute compared to the size of trade, the size of the profits made, etc. So and that's a great case when you talk about platforms, Amazon in that regard. So it is very, very, very hard to do something about it, in particular in our current system, because you need to break up these entities. There's only one historical precedent for breaking up things, and that is antitrust law, which was created in response to the classical market monopolies that emerged at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century in certain markets. For example, Rockefeller combined all oil production in one huge corporation called Standard Oil. And that corporation controlled all of the oil market in the United States in particular. At that time, the United States was the major producer of oil. The Middle East was not that important at that time. And so Standard Oil essentially controlled the overwhelming majority of the oil supply in the economy, in the global economy at that time. And they created at that time, the government in the United States, antitrust law, the Clayton Act is also called, and they used that against Standard Oil, and they broke up the economy, the corporation into pieces, and you got a variety of oil producers as a consequence. That has been applied again in the 1970s to AT&T in the United States. They broke up AT&T because it was controlling all telecommunications at that time, telephony in particular. And they did a step in the 1990s to use it against Microsoft when it was controlling the computer market, the personal computer market by the operating system. That is the kind of act that you need to break up these platforms. But the willingness is completely gone to do that. It is not possible anymore. We no longer have classical monopolies anymore either. They have evolved into platforms. And as a consequence, we look at a slightly different situation, a slightly more complex situation as a consequence. Platforms don't necessarily produce something. They're not a classical market operation. Did I answer your question? I hope so.
You did. And just following on from that, do you think that's going to be the next major economic problem, or the next major cause of a crash?
Yes, well, it is already a major problem, even without a crash, because it is at the source. It is a source of this enormous inequality that we see, and it really affects the functioning of our global economy at the moment, because there is a side that is attached to this, and that is that we can interpret now the economy as a rentier economy, right? This is the idea that money is not made by producing stuff, but by controlling resources, by controlling basic fundamental resources to have power, essentially. And platforms are a major expression of that. And so we are living in a global economy that is based on rent seeking, as it is also called, controlling land, controlling labor, and controlling supply chains. And all of that is done through these platforms. And the economy really shows more and more that it is a rentier economy. And another expression of rentier economy is to call it feudalism. So we are moving now to a system of neo-feudalism, as it can be called, where you make your money solely by owning stuff. You are a landlord. You are a you have power because you have ownership of basic resources or basic knowledge, basic information, and that is what we see more and more and more. And some people argue that we are already in neo-feudalism, and that we are no longer in an economy that really is based on producing things in a classical sense. But for sure, there will be crises related to these platforms, and it might not even be the platforms as we see them today, like the Google, Amazon, those things. It might be related to governments as platforms. The performance of governments at the moment is really important, also with the crisis with COVID at the moment. But it is not easy to see how exactly this will evolve. Yeah, it might be a collapse tomorrow. It might be a collapse 5 years from now, or 10 years, or even longer in the future. Yeah. Yeah. Did I? Okay.
That's great. Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Rob.
Any other questions? All right. So let me summarize with regard to the assignment. It will be available now, a little bit later on Canvas. It is due on the 28th officially, but with the 48-hour rule that we have now, you can hand it in on the 30th. So the 28th is a Friday before midnight, and you can then, with the 48-hour rule, you can extend that to midnight on Sunday. Yeah. If you want more time, I need to know. You have to ask me for some time, and if you need it, and I need to know a good reason for that as well. And then I'm willing to go one more week if necessary, but it cannot go beyond this one more week because of deadlines for marking, and I need to have my time for marking. So beyond the 4th of June is not possible. Yeah. It's also then the official end of the examination period. So all assessments have to be completed by the end of that assessment period, which is that Friday after the 28th of May. That is the final deadline for all assessments in some sense. Yeah. So that is what I can do, but I need to have a reason for that. If you have real issues to complete it, then you can submit the exceptional circumstances form and explaining the reasons, or to have a medical absence, so to say, from the examination, as it is called, and then you completely postpone everything to August or something. But that I would not recommend at all, because it would interfere with your dissertation, of course, your MSc dissertation. And normally you would everybody should start with their MSc dissertation in the first week of June, just complete the assessments, you're done with that, you move on to the dissertation. And the dissertation this year is due at the end of September. They added 2 additional weeks from the standard deadline, which is the 15th of September. This has been postponed this year to the 29th of September. Yeah. Are there any questions related to any of this? All right. Well, if there are no more questions, then I would say let's finish. I hope you found it a useful module. I hope you learned something to look at the world in a new, fresh way. That was my intention, at least. And I hope that it helps you understand the world around you, and it helps you also in your further career, and helps you to think about things and to apply some ideas that we talked about in this module to things that you do in your life, and helps you to get along in your career beyond this program, so to say. All right, thanks for attending, and everybody always showed up at Zoom, I had the impression. Very good attendance, and I appreciate that. It was a hard semester because of the distance. We never met in person, and it might not even happen this summer, who knows. But we will see, and hopefully you thought it was useful as well. Right, thank you. And then talk soon.